April 4th, 1944, Nagaland, India. The garrison at Kohima had been cut off for 3 days. Water was almost gone. The Japanese had seized the high ground to the north and were tightening the ring. 2,000 miles of jungle stood between these men and reinforcement. And somewhere in the dark, 15,000 soldiers of the Japanese 31st Division were preparing to attack again. The officer commanding the defence, Colonel Hugh Richards, had fewer than 1,500 men. Most of them weren't combat soldiers. They were clerks, cooks, hospital staff, engineers. He had no tanks, no artillery within range, no reliable radio contact with the outside world. And the Japanese had cut the water supply on the first day. 15,000 Japanese soldiers were coming up that road. 1,500 men stood in their way. No one gave them a chance. This is Kohima. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're covering the battle where a few hundred fighting soldiers, outnumbered 10-1, without water, fighting across a tennis court, held the gateway to India and broke the back of the Japanese imperial advance in Asia. But before we get to that tennis court, before we watch men throw grenades at enemies close enough to touch, we need to understand what Japan was trying to do, and why this particular ridge in the hills of Nagaland stood between them and everything they wanted. And if you're enjoying this, subscribe. By early 1944, Japan's position in Burma was under increasing pressure. The Allies had been rebuilding, resupplying, and, crucially, learning. The British 14th Army, under General William Slim, was transforming itself into something the Japanese had not yet faced, a force that could match them in the jungle. The supply lines from India through Assam were growing stronger. The air bridge to China was functioning. Time, Japan's commanders understood, was working against them. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi devised his answer, Operation Yugo. The plan was to smash across the Chindwin River with 3 divisions, seize the Allied supply base at Impal, cut the road through Kohima to the rail junction at Dimapur, and ignite an anti-British revolt across India. It was breathtakingly ambitious. It was also based on an assumption that would prove catastrophic, that Japanese troops could live off captured Allied supplies and off the land, moving faster than the British could respond. The critical hinge of the entire operation was Kohima. Situated at 5,000 feet in the Naga Hills, the town controlled the only road connecting Dimapur, with its enormous supply depots, to Impal. If the Japanese took Kohima and held the road, the British IV Corps at Impal would be cut off, and the supply base at Dimapur would be exposed. Take Dimapur, and the whole Allied position in eastern India unravelled. Mutaguchi's plan called for the 31st Division under Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato to encircle and capture Kohima. Sato had 15,000 men. He was told to carry enough supplies for 3 weeks, after which he would live off what he captured. He crossed the Chindwin in March 1944 and moved through jungle that British commanders had considered impassable for large forces. That assumption, the same mistake the British had made about Japanese capabilities repeatedly since 1941, very nearly cost them the battle before it began. The garrison at Kohima on April 4th, when the Japanese arrived in force, was not what anyone would have chosen to defend a position of such importance. The 4th Battalion Royal West Kent Regiment formed the professional corps, experienced soldiers, steady and well led. Around them were Assam Rifles, the Nepalese Garrison Company, administrative units, the Garrison Engineering Detachment, and several hundred non-combatants, including wounded from other actions. The field hospital was inside the perimeter. So were the stores, the communications centre, and the district commissioner's bungalow, with its tennis court. Colonel Richards organised his defence across a series of terraces cut into the hillside. The perimeter was never large, at its widest point, less than 700 yards across. As the Japanese pushed in over the following days, it shrank further. The garrison held Garrison Hill at the centre, with a series of smaller positions, FSD Hill, Detail Hill, Kuki Piquet, the DC's bungalow, arranged around it on the terrace slopes. The Japanese attacked on the night of April 5th and did not stop for more than 7 weeks. What followed has no real parallel in British military experience. The terrain made flanking movements almost impossible. Both sides were locked into the same narrow ridge, the same terraces, the same shallow hillside positions carved out of Naga clay. Japanese attacks came at night, preceded by mortar fire and the screaming of banzai charges that were designed as much for psychological effect as tactical. British and Indian soldiers held their positions in darkness, firing at muzzle flashes, throwing grenades at sounds, using bayonets when the enemy reached the wire. The water was the worst of it in the first week. The Japanese cut the supply pipes on the first day. The tanks inside the perimeter held perhaps 2 days of water. After that, men were rationed to a few mouthfuls a day for drinking, with nothing left for cooking or washing wounds. The April heat on the ridge was punishing. Men fought in body armour, soaked with sweat they couldn't replace. Thirst, in the accounts of survivors, occupied their thoughts as much as the Japanese. Some men licked dew from leaves. Others collected water from shell craters, straining it through cloth. The Royal Air Force dropped supplies when the weather allowed: rations, water, ammunition. The Dakota crews flew low over the ridge, often in conditions that made precision impossible, and pushed supplies out of the doors. Some loads fell into Japanese positions. Some were scattered by wind across hillsides too steep to retrieve. But enough reached the garrison to keep it fighting. And through all of it, the tennis court. The district commissioner's bungalow had been a pleasant place once, a colonial administrator's house in the Naga Hills, surrounded by flower gardens and a modest tennis court. By mid-April 1944, it had become the epicentre of the most savage close-quarter fighting on the Burma front. The Japanese held the south side of the court, the British held the north. The distance between their forward positions was the width of a tennis court baseline, roughly 10 yards. Both sides dug into the terraced earth banks. Both sides threw grenades across the net. Snipers on each side targeted any movement. At night, Japanese soldiers crept forward under cover of mortar fire to attack the British positions with bayonets and swords. British soldiers fixed their own bayonets and waited. The 4th Royal West Kents, in the accounts that survive, describe the tennis court fighting with a matter-of-factness that says everything about what sustained combat does to a man's sense of the extraordinary. It became normal. Every 30 minutes, another attack. Every dawn, the same positions. Every night, the same darkness and the same sounds. Captain John Nettlefield, commanding one of the forward positions, recorded that his men were sleeping in shifts of 45 minutes. After 2 weeks of this, he wrote, the survivors had developed a kind of detached efficiency, loading, firing, reloading, almost without thought. The exhaustion had passed through ordinary tiredness into something beyond it. Men functioned, they held. The Japanese were also suffering. Sato's logistics had failed almost from the beginning. His division had arrived at Kohima after a brutal march through jungle with supplies already running short. The promised ration depots at Kohima either didn't exist or were better defended than anticipated. By mid-April, his men were fighting on quarter rations. The monsoon was coming, which would make resupply by any means nearly impossible. Mutaguchi, far to the south at his headquarters, sent messages demanding that Sato continue attacking, regardless of casualties, regardless of supply. Sato, watching his men die of starvation and dysentery as much as British fire, began composing replies to his superior that grew increasingly insubordinate. Outside the perimeter, the relief was coming, but slowly. The 2nd Division under Major General John Grover had been redirected from other operations and was fighting its way up the road from Dimapur. The terrain worked against speed. The road wound through steep hills, easily blocked by small Japanese rearguard positions that required time and lives to clear. Artillery was being moved up. Tanks, Lee and Grant tanks of the 149th Regiment Royal Armoured Corps, were being nursed along roads not built for armour. Inside the perimeter, the garrison had been told relief was coming. The information helped morale less than anyone hoped. Every night that relief didn't arrive was another night of grenades and bayonets and thirst. The relief column reached the outer Japanese positions on April 18th, 2 weeks after the siege began. Progress through the Japanese defensive ring was measured in yards. Grover's division fought for each hilltop, each bend in the road. The Japanese had positioned themselves with skill across the ridges above the road, and dislodging them required artillery, infantry assault, and tank fire in combination. The tanks were the key. On May 4th, following weeks of fighting, on the approaches, armour reached the ridge itself. A Lee tank was manoeuvred up slopes that its crew considered impossible, trailing behind infantry who cleared the path with their bodies. The tank reached the DC's bungalow area and opened fire on Japanese positions at point-blank range. 20 yards in some cases. The psychological effect on men who had endured weeks of siege under fire was visible in the accounts. The sound of armour beside them, the sight of Japanese positions demolished by direct tank fire, changed something fundamental in the fighting. The 2nd Division relieved the Kohima garrison on April 20th, though the fighting for the ridge itself would continue for weeks. The Royal West Kents, when they came out of the perimeter, had been in sustained close combat for 15 days without adequate water, food, or sleep. They had suffered 60% casualties. What remained of the battalion walked out of Kohima with a particular bearing of men who have been through something that cannot be fully communicated. The battle for the ridge continued through May and into June as the 2nd Division, reinforced and supported by artillery, methodically cleared the Japanese from the surrounding hills. Sato by this point had made his decision. On May 31st, without authorization from Mutaguchi or from 15th Army headquarters, he ordered his division to withdraw. It was an act of insubordination, almost without precedent in Japanese military culture. Sato's reasoning was simple and brutal. His men were dying of starvation. The promised supplies had never come. To continue attacking was not sacrifice in service of a plan. It was waste in service of a fiction. Mutaguchi relieved Sato of command and ordered a court-martial. The court-martial proceedings were quietly dropped when it became clear that Sato's charges against his superior officer, that Mutaguchi had ordered an operation without adequate logistics, knowing it was impossible, and had left his men to die, were substantially accurate. The withdrawal from Kohima became the worst military disaster in Japanese history. Sato's men, already weakened by malnutrition and disease, retreated through the monsoon jungle without supplies, without medical support, and with the 2nd Division pursuing. The track they followed back to the Chindwin became known as the Retreat Road, and then by a more specific name, the White Bone Road, for what lined its edges as men died and were left where they fell. Of the 15,000 men Sato had brought to Kohima, roughly 7,000 were dead or dying by the time the retreat ended. Operation Ugo, the invasion of India, had failed completely. The Imphal garrison, resupplied by air and defended by IV Corps, held out and then counterattacked. The two battles together, Kohima and Imphal, broke the 31st, 15th and 33rd Divisions of the Japanese Burma Area Army. Japan would never mount another strategic offensive in Burma. The men who held Kohima came from across the empire that Britain had built. The 4th Royal West Kents were from Maidstone and Tunbridge and the towns of Kent. The Assam Rifles were Naga and Assamese soldiers who knew these hills as home. The Rajputana Rifles, the Nepalese Gurkhas, the administrative units who found themselves fighting in a perimeter they had never expected to defend. They held a ridge that no one had properly prepared and that everyone understood could not fall. The battle has a memorial inscription that has become one of the most famous in the English language. It stands in the Kohima War Cemetery, where 1,420 men are buried among the hills where they died. When you go home, tell them of us and say, "For your tomorrow, we gave our today." In 1944, the difference between India remaining in Allied hands and Japan controlling the subcontinent's eastern approaches came down to 1,500 men on a hilltop without water. What they did, holding across that tennis court, throwing grenades at men 10 yards away, staying in position on rations that should have broken them, was not the work of soldiers fighting, because orders left them no choice. The Royal West Kents could have broken. Every calculation of survival said they should have broken. They didn't. And because they didn't, Japan's war in Asia turned here, on this ridge, over those 64 days. That is what Kohima was. If this is the kind of history that moves you, the last stands, the positions that should have fallen, the men who held when the mathematics of the situation said they couldn't, then you know what to do. Thank you for watching Britain's history, the battles that shaped a nation, told the way they deserve.